and you took back your country. And if things keep going like they're going, we'll go and we'll do what we have to do. We'll do a 3 and a 4 and a 5. Watch. They'll have tomorrow. We knew No, I don't want to say.
Donald Trump produces a lot of words at his rallies and on Twitter. We are bombarded with his words. And sometimes those words join together to form sentences. And often those sentences are expressing something truly horrible. He has openly threatened to wipe out not one, but 2 countries from the face of the planet, North Korea and Iran. He seems truly enamored of some of the most authoritarian figures in power in countries across the world, and will often defend those leaders unprompted from rightful criticism and protest. I think many people have to actively force themselves to resist becoming numb to what has become a consistent stream of tyrannical rhetoric. But history teaches us that we must take Donald Trump's threats or his trial balloons seriously. One of Trump's favorite threats, which he makes almost daily, is that he wants to lock up his political opponents, most famously Hillary Rodham Clinton. Unfortunately, it is decidedly not beyond the pale to imagine Donald Trump and his Attorney General William Barr putting into action a plan to make such prosecutions of political opponents a reality. In fact, in Barr's little media blitz last week, he spoke in cryptic terms about some of his thinking on all of this.
Because I think people have to find out what the government was doing during that period. If we're worried about foreign influence, for the very same reason, we should be worried about whether government officials abuse their power and put their thumb on the scale. And so I'm not saying that happened, but I'm saying that we have to look at that.
So will we see a real effort to lock up Hillary Clinton or to indict Obama-era officials on treason charges? What if it looks like Trump may actually lose to one of those 23 or so Democrats running for office? Are we going to hear chants to lock up Bernie the socialist or Joe Biden? This may seem like a leap, but this is effectively what one of Trump's fellow brethren in the authoritarianism movement is doing right now in Brazil. That country's former president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, popularly known as Lula, is currently spending most of his day inside a prison cell. Officially, Lula is there serving a 12-year sentence on corruption allegations. His conviction came at the culmination of a sweeping corruption probe into a phenomenon known as Operation Car Wash that involved charges of bribery relating to the state-owned oil company Petrobras, off-the-books renovations of a beachfront property owned by Lula, and other alleged crimes. Now, in a moment, we're going to dig into what this scandal was all about. Now, Lula and his supporters say that this prosecution is political and aimed at destroying the Workers' Party that Lula had built up, as well as ridding Brazil of the leftist agenda that came to be known as Lulaism. 4 days into Jair Bolsonaro's presidency, the prosecutor in the Lula case, Sergio Moro, was named the Minister of Justice and Public Security. He's basically the Attorney General. Lula has been in prison for more than a year, much of it in what amounts to solitary confinement. He has been barred from speaking to the press and has largely been silenced. But just last week, my colleague Glenn Greenwald managed to get into the prison where he conducted a wide-ranging interview with Lula. We're going to hear some highlights from that interview, and Glenn Greenwald joins me now from Rio de Janeiro. Glenn, welcome back to Intercepted.
Jeremy, thank you so much for inviting me back on.
How did you go and visit Lula, and where did you see him?
It's really fascinating because in order to interview Lula, you have to travel to a previously totally unknown town called Curitiba. Lula is kept in this kind of special prison that's really a makeshift jail built inside the federal police headquarters. We have actually been petitioning the Brazilian courts for over a year now to be able to interview him. Obviously, his input about the 2018 election as Bolsonaro ascended and the possibility of a Bolsonaro presidency became more likely made Lula's analysis, something of great interest to the country. The courts just refused to allow us to interview him. They just silenced him throughout all of 2018. And yet now suddenly in 2019, now that Bolsonaro is safely elected and the election is over, this spate of judicial authorizations was issued, one of which was for us that allowed us to interview him. So the timing of it was very strange, particularly since the country's most violent criminals are routinely interviewed in prison.
Why is Lula in prison and how long has he been there?
There's this sweeping corruption scheme that has ushered in the country's richest and most powerful politicians across the political spectrum into prison.
An investigation called Operação Lava Jato, Operation Car Wash.
Imagine if the Watergate investigation had led not only to the downfall of President Nixon, but also to allegations against his successor, plus the Speaker of the House, the leader of the Senate, a third of the cabinet, and more than 90 members of Congress.
Operation Car Wash, the sweeping probe that has rocked Brazil's political class to the core.
The case really began because they caught some guy who was laundering money through a car wash. And that's what led them to this sweeping corruption scandal that has led to the exposure of what really has for decades been systemic corruption in Brazil. It led to billionaires going to prison, the people who lead the biggest construction and oil companies. It involves massive graft with contracts at Petrobras, the huge state-owned oil giant that fuels a lot of Brazil's social programs, and then ultimately the most powerful leaders in Brazil. And Lula is accused of essentially being the chief of that corruption scheme. And yet, none of the accusations that have actually formally been brought against him involved anything of that magnitude. But that isn't at all what he's been charged with. What they did instead was they took this case that was always regarded as this very kind of trivial, highly dubious, very petty case in the scheme of the corruption analysis, namely that he received what they're calling a triplex to make it sound glamorous, but which is actually this ratty, rundown apartment in Sao Paulo that Lula would have been able to buy on his own 1,000 times over, and claimed that he was given to him in exchange for favors that he did for a construction company. A judge, who is now Bolsonaro's justice minister, chose that case because of how small it was, which meant that they could process it really quickly through the courts, get him convicted in time to make him ineligible for the 2018 presidential race, particularly since, we should all recall, Lula was actually leading in all of the polls. He has been sentenced to, first it was 9 years, on appeal it was increased to 10 years. If for good behavior, if he serves 1/6 of his term, he may be able to be released and serve the remainder of his sentence in what's called semi-open regime, which means he could essentially be a prisoner based at home using an ankle bracelet. But he's been in jail now for 1 year and 2 months, and he's going to be there for at least another 6 months under what is now a 9-year prison sentence.
Estou pronto.
Pronto?
Pronto.
Vocês falam quando estamos prontos.
Glenn, what kind of conditions is Lula being held in right now?
So the first question I asked him is, has your treatment been professional and humanitarian? And he basically said,
Eu não sei o que é tratamento humanitário na prisão. Eu tô preso, tô numa solitária. A verdade é que é uma solitária, porque
I don't know what humanitarian treatment in a prison means. I'm locked up, and I'm in solitary confinement, and it really is solitary, because most of the time I'm completely alone. I meet with my lawyers, and that's it. And with my family once a week. I don't know whether to consider this decent.
Com muita esperança.
What allows me to endure this without hate and with hope is knowing that there are millions and millions of Brazilians living in freedom who, even so, are in worse conditions than I am.
Sabe?
But what he really then pivoted to was saying that the strategy of these prosecutors, which really is true, is...
Não, faz muitos anos que nós brigamos para acabar a tortura. Agora a tortura é mais sofisticada. Ela é com base na delação premiada.
No, listen. We've been fighting for years to end torture. These days, torture has more sophisticated forms. It's based on plea bargaining, on the thousands of lies told simultaneously, over and over, and people imprisoned for 2 or 3 years until they say what the prosecutor a police commissioner wants to hear. I could cite the example of Antonio Palocci's plea bargain, where he's lying in the most unbelievable manner. Or take Léo Pinheiro, for example, who's imprisoned and lying through his teeth to get out. The secret is to talk about Lula. This has been going on for 5 years. You know that I'm here, even though neither the judge, the prosecutor, or the federal police commissioner who launched the investigation have any proof against me. They know that the apartment is in mine. They know that the ranch is in mine. But they keep up these lies.
Mas eles contaram uma mentira.
That's how they got Lula, was essentially by coercing these people who never were convicted, who were never even charged, but who nonetheless were, quote, preventatively imprisoned. They wouldn't let them out unless they fingered Lula for crimes that Lula insists he never committed, but that they accused him of in order to get out of prison. So he feels the whole system itself is inherently abusive, inherently inhumane, because it's designed to isolate people from society until they start giving people what they want. But he's not being physically tortured, but I think he feels like he's being certainly psychologically abused.
Now, I want to ask you about two very serious allegations that Lula made during this interview with you. The first saying, he said that he was certain that the U.S. Department of Justice was behind his situation.
Eu tenho clareza de que tudo que aconteceu neste país, em função da Lava Jato.
I have no doubt, Glenn, that everything that's happened in connection with Operation Car Wash has been to prevent Lula from running for president.
Hoje eu tenho muita clareza. Da mesma forma que eu tenho clareza.
Nowadays, I'm certain of this. The same way that I'm certain that the U.S. Department of Justice is behind us.
And also that interest in the petroleum resources of Brazil was at the center of what not only happened to him, but also the coup against Dilma Rousseff, the former president of Brazil.
Por tudo. Da mesma forma que eu tenho.
I can only have my own convictions, that's all. In the same way that I'm certain that what happened to me and Dilma is also connected to Brazil's oil resources. Namely, the coup against Dilma, my imprisonment, the accusations.
Talk about what he is talking about there.
So let's just remind everybody about the geostrategic importance of Brazil. It's not just a huge country. It's the fifth largest, most populous country on the planet. It has massive oil reserves, as well as the most important environmental resource on the planet, which is the Amazon, which is not just important environmentally, but economically as well. Remember back in 2013 and 2014, when we were doing the Snowden reporting, one of the stories we did with the largest international repercussions was that there was massive NSA spying along with GCHQ in Canada on Petrobras, as well as Brazil's Ministry of Mines and Energy. So the energy industry in Brazil has long been of great interest to the United States and its Western allies. So anytime the U.S. is this directly involved in any country, and it's long been involved in Brazil, it overthrew its government in 1964, supported a military dictatorship for 21 years, of course, its interest in oil is a major factor. And Lula strongly believes, and there's starting to be some evidence that is emerging, and I can't actually talk a lot about it because we're currently involved in the reporting of it, suggesting that the U.S. was working hand in hand with the Brazilian prosecutors in order to ensure that Lula ended up in prison. And a big part of why that suspicion has taken hold is because the head judge, Sergio Moro, as well as his primary deputy, were both trained in the U.S. at Harvard. Bolsonaro's finance minister, who wants to privatize everything, was trained at the University of Chicago. There's all kinds of links demonstrated by the WikiLeaks cables between the opposition to Lula working hand in hand with the U.S. government to undermine the Brazilian government and destabilize it for exactly these reasons. So I'm not ready to back up Lula's accusation yet and say that it's absolutely confirmed and true, but I will say that it's far more than just some kind of fever dream or conspiracy theory. There is starting to emerge concrete evidence that the U.S. had a bigger role in all of these events than has been previously known.
In the interview, Lula actually mentions that he considers himself a friend of Hillary Clinton's. And I wonder if you see some parallels between what's happened to Lula and then Trump's seeming obsession with putting his political opponents in jail, most prominently, without question, Hillary Clinton.
I'd be surprised if he were really friends with Hillary Clinton. I think he more is emphasizing the fact that he always had a positive relationship with the Democratic Party. And interestingly, that was in the context of my asking him, because he has blamed in the past the failures of neoliberalism for the rise of right-wing extremism. He doesn't blame Russia. He doesn't blame WikiLeaks. He doesn't blame the New York Times. He blames the failures of neoliberalism. And yet, in many ways, his government, Lula, despite his reputation as a leftist, governed more as a neoliberal party, even though he helped the poor, the banks, and the oligarchical companies and the oligarchical class in Brazil thrive during his presidency. So there's always been this question, this kind of difficult to reconcile narrative between, on the one hand, Lula saying he's in jail because the rich and the elite hate him, and on the other, the reality that the rich and the elite thrived under his government. I think what they were most worried about wasn't so much, let's just put him in jail because he's the enemy of Bolsonaro. I think what they were most worried about was that they thought that they had finally the conditions, once they removed Dilma, to put in a real center-right, banking-friendly, austerity-eager politician who was going to win the presidency. And the only thing that stood in the way between that wet dream of theirs and the realization of it was Lula. And the only way to stop Lula from running again and winning again was to render him ineligible by quickly convicting him of a crime. That's certainly what Lula believes, and there's a lot of reasons to believe that that's true.
Explain this to us, Glenn.
So there's always been this tension between this elite versus PT narrative and the reality that the elite thrived. And Lula's point was a really interesting one that I've never heard him articulate before, was yes, they were happy with the way that our government helped them economically, but it isn't only about economics, it's about culture.
Glenn, nós começamos a nossa entrevista, eu comecei dizendo que o grande problema do PT não foram o erro do PT. O grande problema do PT foram os acertos do PT.
Glenn, when we started this interview, I said clearly that PT's biggest problems come not from its errors, but its successes. Every time that a president tries to enact socially minded policies in Latin America, they're eventually ousted. The elite in Brazil and in other countries don't accept economic development policies that contain social inclusion. PT managed to enact, and this is according to the UN, not me, the greatest changes in social inclusion in the history of this country. It's important to remember that during our mandate, it was the only time in history that the poor had a higher rate of economic upturn than the rich. The rich made gains too, but the poor at an even greater percentage. It was the only time in history, and this bothered people. You should have heard it in the Rio de Janeiro airport, in the São Paulo airport, when people said, this airport is beginning to look like a bus station, with these poor people all around, people who had never taken a plane in their life.
It's about who are the people who run the country. Is it the kind of people like me who come from poverty, who didn't learn to read until I was 10, who don't speak perfect Portuguese, who wasn't educated in the best schools, who put Black people and indigenous people in my cabinet, who put the first woman president in power because I chose her as my successor? Or is it going to be the rich, white people from the noble families who are going to continue to run Brazil and hold all the power? It's more of a cultural clash. And the reason they were so hostile to PT was because the left was starting to change Brazil, not economically, but culturally. And it was a way of saying, you've encroached too far on what are our inherent privileges. People aren't just motivated by money. They're also motivated by a sense of their own privilege and power and entitlement and class allegiance that they've always viewed Lula, someone as kind of a pretender to the throne, as threatening.
Explain the Brazil that Lula was born into and the changes that have occurred over the decades, culminating with Lula's election as president of Brazil.
Honestly, one of the things that emotionally affected me in having to travel to a prison to interview Lula, a politician of singular charisma and force and really greatness, is that Lula radically transformed one of the most important countries on the planet. Remember, Brazil is one of the worst countries when it comes to inequality of all kinds. It was the last country to eliminate slavery, even after the U.S., by about 20 years. Pervasive racism continues to be one of the most important characteristics of how the country is run. And for decades, people who were born into poverty, into favelas, had zero hope, zero, of not just themselves ever getting out, but their children getting out as well. And Lula radically transformed all of that really single-handedly. So to see him sitting in a prison cell withering away when just 8 years ago he left office with 86% approval rating is a real tragedy. And it kind of reflects this trajectory of Brazil that was prospering for so long in such a promising way, only to see everything unravel and collapse so quickly. Lula sitting in a prison cell is a really stark metaphor for that.
Now, Glenn, you and your husband, David Miranda, who now is a member of the Brazilian Congress, were close to Marielle Franco, who was a city council person that was assassinated. David Miranda, of course, is also regularly subject to threats. You as well have had to take precautions because of the risks that both you and David are taking by speaking out at a particularly dangerous moment. At the same time, you also, Glenn, are being widely criticized for your repeated appearances on Fox News. And, you and I have talked about this before, and we have our disagreements on that. But when you were on Laura Ingraham's show on Fox News, and it seemed to me that she wanted you to come on to bash Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats, but you changed the script up when you discovered that Bolsonaro was going to be interviewed right after you. It was a pre-taped segment, but they were going to air it. Talk about what you did that night on Laura Ingraham's show and the context of it.
Interestingly, when they did finally apprehend the two ex-police officers who murdered Marielle, they still don't know who paid them to kill her. But when they apprehended their cell phones and computers, what they discovered was that there were about 6 or 7 left-wing activists, journalists, and politicians whose public events they were continuing to monitor in the wake of Marielle's murder, one of whose was David's and one of whose was mine. And so we obviously take those threats very seriously. And I do the same thing in Brazil, nonetheless, that I do in the U.S., which is I go on right-wing shows, including pro-Bolsonaro ones, for a lot of the same reasons, which is I think it's important to try and influence them. The thing that happened on Fox that was really interesting was the right wing in Brazil reveres Fox News because Bolsonaro reveres the U.S. It's called a vira-lata complex here in Brazil, that certain Brazilians just look up to the U.S., have kind of an inferiority complex to it. And so I knew Bolsonaro was going on Fox News as part of his trip to the U.S. It was a huge deal in Brazil, but particularly for his followers. And so I went on live knowing that all of Brazil was waiting to watch Bolsonaro, coming on 15 minutes after I was. And she asked me a question, which I then ignored and talked about Bolsonaro instead. So that right before he was on, he had to hear me saying...
Exactly. I mean, where I know we've been working on an expose about some really incredibly criminal acts on the part of the Brazilian president, Jair Bolsonaro, who's in Washington this week.
Yes, he's here.
To meet with Donald Trump. And there and actually he's going to be on Shannon Bream's show next, I believe. There you see what a real scandal looked like. He's only been in office for 2 months. There's incredible amounts of concrete, tangible evidence that has been publicly disclosed, linking him to the world's worst paramilitary gangs and extrajudicial murderers in the country. That's what a real scandal looks like. Instead, in the U.S., we have 2 years of speculation.
And that night was particularly difficult because I knew that was going to really make me a major target, because Bolsonaro being on Fox News was a major, major event, particularly for Bolsonaro's followers here in Brazil. And so to have to watch me, in their eyes, defame him on Trump TV was something that created a kind of fury that I haven't quite experienced in the 13 years that I've been working as a journalist.
Recently, your husband, David Miranda, was profiled by Time magazine, and the headline was Next Generation Leaders, How This Black Gay Politician is Standing Up to the Far-Right Government in Brazil. Explain how David, who grew up in one of the poorest favelas in Brazil, ended up being a member of the Brazilian Congress.
Yeah, so just like we were talking about Lula before, and his argument that it's more about culture than economics, and Lula was always treated like he never belonged in the halls of power. David very much is treated the same way. He speaks with an accent that immediately identifies him as somebody who grew up in a favela. In 2016, David ran for city council as part of the left-wing Socialist Party, along with Marielle Franco, who you mentioned earlier, who was assassinated. And the two of them have very similar backgrounds. They both come from favelas. They both are black. They're both LGBT. They both work against police brutality and the abuses of the state. And they were best friends. And so what made their election so remarkable is that it's so rare for people like that to be in the halls of power. And Marielle's death is what inspired David to want to run for Congress in 2018. He came in the 5th spot. His party got 4 seats. The 4th seat was won by an incumbent, Jean Willis, who for a long time was the only openly gay member of the Brazilian Congress. For 10 years, he was physically bullied in the Congress. Members of Congress would bump into him, would push him against walls, would call him a faggot because he was the only openly gay member of the entire Congress. He was basically alone. And once Bolsonaro's movement got strength, he started getting very specific death threats. Here's a picture of your license plate and your address. We know where you live. You can't hide from us. We're going to murder you. And he just reached the point where, especially being in Brasilia with the Bolsonaro movement dominant, he felt like his life was in serious danger and psychologically he couldn't endure it anymore. And he announced that he was leaving the country. He doesn't speak any other languages. It's the only other country that he knew. That's how extreme that decision was. And that spot opened up and it automatically was David's because he was next in line in the election. And now David has become the leader essentially of the LGBT movement, on top of which being black and also from the favelas makes him a particularly visceral target for the kind of hatred that caused Jean to flee the country. One of the reasons why we also have become a target, and I think it's so important to point this out, is in 2016, the Intercept got behind the funding of the Intercept Brazil, and we put together a team of mostly young, all Brazilian editors and journalists whose courage and journalistic persistence I cannot overstate. And the work that they have done in uncovering corruption by Bolsonaro and uncovering by the far right has really contributed to a big part of why I'm the target, even though it's them on the front lines and them doing the work. It's associated with me. So the Intercept Brazil deserves a huge mention. I think when you and I started the Intercept, the kind of journalism we imagined is exactly the kind of journalism that they're now doing in Brazil at a time when it's most needed, at great risk to themselves as well. And so that's a big part of the picture also.
Glenn Greenwald, thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks, Jeremy.
My colleague Glenn Greenwald is co-founder of The Intercept, the founder of Intercept Brazil. Look for the video of Glenn's prison interview with Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva at theintercept.com. And if you speak Portuguese, make sure to check out the incredible journalism being done by our colleagues in Brazil at theintercept.com/Brazil. That's Brazil with an S.